Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us for the release of the 2021 Indiana Civic Health Index. We appreciate you being here. My name is Chuck Dunlap, and I'm President and CEO of the Indiana Bar Foundation. The Indiana Bar Foundation has been the primary sponsor of the Indiana Civic Health Index project since the initial index was released back in 2011. And the 2021 index is our fifth edition over those 10 years, which really gives us a unique opportunity to review and analyze the data over a decade, and to look at Indiana's performance in a variety of areas of civic health and how they've progressed over time. But before we get into the report itself, I just want to take a moment to thank our partners, many of whom have been involved with this project since that first report in 2011. In addition to the Indiana Bar Foundation, the Civic Health Index would not be possible without the support of these partners, several of who you'll be hearing from this morning as we progress. And a complete list of the partners and sponsors is in the report itself. So turning to the report, as some of you may remember, in the previous version of the Indiana Civic Health Index from 2019, not only did we examine data about how Indiana compared with our sister states in areas of civic health like volunteering, making charitable donations, and engaging in community and government, but we also issued two recommendations that we identified as important to increasing the overall civic health of Indiana, and that's the first time that we did that. So in this version, the 2021 version, we wanted to take a look first at those recommendations, the first of which was focused on increasing civic education in Indiana, and the second recommendation focused on increasing voter participation. And we wanted to give you a little bit of an update on the progress for those recommendations. And I'm going to start talking about the civic education aspect and the civic education recommendation first. So again, in 2020, shortly after the release of the 2019 Civic Health Index, the Indiana Bar Foundation created a civic education task force that was charged with looking at methods of instruction, programs, educational outcomes to improve civic education opportunities for all Hoosiers. And that was a direct result of the 2019 recommendation to create that task force. The task force was led by Indiana Lieutenant Governor Suzanne Crouch and had members who were leaders in education, government, business, and nonprofit from across the state. And throughout the course of 2020, which as you recall was a year that we didn't expect things to be developing the way they did with the pandemic, but the task force met regardless during that time, and the members virtually, but the members heard testimony from national, state, and local experts about the most effective pedagogy and practices in civic education. These task force meetings and additional outside research that we conducted through that process provided an overview of how Indiana's civic education opportunities and programs could be improved. And upon the end of this time, the task force work culminated with a report that was issued in November of 2020. And this report really serves as the roadmap for our continued advancement in civic education in Indiana. And one of the major findings in the task force report was that the time spent in schools teaching civics is just not adequate, and it has been steadily decreasing over the years as well. In order to address this trend in schools, many of the recommendations from the original report involved expanding the amount of time devoted to civic education in schools, and also critically providing more opportunities for civic education at earlier ages. So the next significant step on the development of that particular recommendation and that goal of improving civic education came in 2021, last year, with the passing of House Bill 1384 into law. And many of you will remember that House Bill 1384 was authored by Representative Tony Cook, who was a member of the initial Bar Foundation task force, and it did several things. First, it created a permanent civic education commission to carry on the work that the Bar Foundation's task force did, which ended, the Bar Foundation's task force ended in 2020 with the release of its report. So this new commission will carry on that work in a unified and enduring way, which is really a great step in the right direction. Secondly, the legislation also required a separate standard for middle school civics, a middle school civics course to be developed by July 1st of this year, 2022. So that's coming as well in the near future. And then the third requirement for the law was that beginning in 2023 and the 2024 school year, all schools have to provide a required semester-long course in civics at some point during the middle school years, grades 6th, 7th, or 8th. And that is going to be based on those standards that are currently being developed. So that's just a brief summary of some of the civic education advancements that have happened since as a result of the last Civic Health Index and its recommendations. And we're extremely pleased with the overall progress we've seen in advancing civic education over the past 2 years since the last Civic Health Index in 2019, but there's certainly more work to be done. And for example, a few areas that were still left to be accomplished within that overall scheme and the overall plan that we put in place previously from the task force, we want to have additional civics content for pre-service teachers and also expand professional development opportunities for teachers once they enter the classroom as well. This is just critical for the advancement of civics and continued increasing of knowledge by the teachers as well. We also want the student experience in civics courses to include ways to help prepare them for their entire civic life as adults. This can include incorporation of civics projects, the use of authentic assessments in courses like the We the People program, which has been very successful in Indiana and across the country, and also the creation of more opportunities for community engagement and partnership in school curriculum. These real-world applications can really be influential in establishing a benchmark for students to establish these habits when they're in school and continue them throughout their life. The Indiana Bar Foundation will continue to work with our partners throughout the state to make sure that we maintain the momentum that's been developed as we work towards seeing more tangible progress from the 2020 Task Force report, hopefully in future civic health indexes. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to Bill Morrow, who is the founder and president of the Indiana Citizen Education Foundation, which is one of the sponsors of the report. Bill is also a contributing author to the 2021 Civic Health Index, and he's going to be talking about the progress on our second recommendation from the 2019 report, which was focused on voter participation. So Bill, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Chuck. Before I dive into my part of the partnership, I want to say a few things about Chuck, who last September marked his 20th anniversary as president and CEO of the Indiana Bar Foundation. We don't have the time now to list his many accomplishments, but this much is absolutely certain. Indiana would not have published its first Indiana Civic Health Index in 2011, but for Chuck's energy and persistence and the strong and visible support of two of Indiana's greatest statespeople, former Congressman Lee Hamilton and then Indiana Chief Justice Randall Shepard, who've since been joined by former Attorney General Greg Zeller. As Chuck noted in his remarks, right on the heels of the publication of the 2019 edition, Chuck signed up the Bar Foundation for pursuing recommendation number 1 and went to work assembling the Blue Ribbon Task Force that was led by Lieutenant Governor Crouch, which produced the report that was translated into House Enrolled Act 1384. Those few words make the journey from takeoff to landing sound pretty simple. But I can tell you it was an enormous, complicated, and time-consuming undertaking that I submit only a leader and consensus builder like Chuck could have pulled off. So recommendation number 1 of the 2019 Indiana Civic Health Index, done. Which brings me to recommendation number 2, which our little nonprofit startup, the Indiana Citizen Education Foundation, volunteered to pursue. So let me refresh your recollection about recommendation number 2 from the 2019 report, which we released in November of 2019. Recommendation number 2 said, as we head toward the 2020 elections, Indiana should aspire to increase voting turnout substantially with the goal of moving from the bottom 10 to the top 10 of states. And I also want you to keep in mind that our 2021 report, which we're releasing today, uses data from 2020, right? A presidential election year. And so our reference point is 2016. When you read the report, you will see that presidential election years are tracked separately from midterm election years for obvious reasons. Well, rather than jumping from the bottom 10 to the top 10 for turnout, Indiana actually dropped 5 spots from 41st in 2016 to 46th in 2020. True, turnout improved in Indiana almost 3 percentage points from 58.3% in 2016 to 61% in 2020. But in comparison, turnout in the top 10 states averaged more than 75%, almost a 6 percentage point increase from 2016. The national average went from more than 61% in 2016 to almost 67% in 2020. Using the official turnout numbers from the Secretary of State's office, we saw turnout in Indiana above 3 million for the first time. About 261,000 more votes were cast in 2020 than 2016, more than a 9.3% increase, but turnout nationally went up 15%. The Secretary of State's official 2020 turnout number, 3,068,625, presents a valuable check on the accuracy of our data, right? 61% of the Hoosiers surveyed for our report said they voted in November 2020. If you multiply that percentage, 61%, by the voting eligible population of Indiana in November 2020, right at 5 million, you get 3,050,000. Now, bear with me here. I'm getting kind of in the weeds. So let me go back over that. The Secretary of State's official 2020 turnout number was 3,068,625. So because our data is derived from survey research, right? We're reporting that 61% of the Hoosiers surveyed said they voted in November 2020. You multiply 61% times the voting eligible population of Indiana on election day 2020, which is right at 5 million, you get 3,050,000, which is within 0.6% of the number that the Secretary of State reported. 0.6%. So you'd think that when you're asked whether you voted in the last election, you're more likely to fib on the yes side, right? But Hoosiers are remarkably honest when they answer this question. The data we report for turnout goes back to 1972. And you can see Indiana's turnout either above or right at the national average for the next 20 years. And if you want to go even farther back, I pulled a book out of my library published in 1979 called Voting in Indiana that looked at presidential elections from 1924 to 1976. And the authors found Indiana consistently ranked in the top 10 of states until 1972. Well, with Indiana now mired in the bottom states for turnout, it occurred to us to examine the election administration policy choices made by states which are consistently among the top 10. So we looked at the rankings going back to 2010 and identified 7 jurisdictions that are most often in the top 10. So when you dive into your copy of the 2021 report, you'll see a chart on page 16 that lists 7 states in alphabetical, or 7 jurisdictions in alphabetical order: Colorado, the District of Columbia, Iowa, Maine, Minnesota, Oregon, and Wisconsin. And you'll see the policy choices most of them have made, such as automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration, unrestricted absentee voting, independent redistricting commissions, and mail-in voting. The chart will show you that Indiana has made none of those policy choices. And I think it's fair to say Indiana isn't likely to do so in the foreseeable future. In fact, Indiana is consistently ranked among the states with the most restrictive voting laws. This begs the question, shouldn't legislation affecting the conduct of Indiana elections be analyzed through the prism of whether the bill encourages or discourages additional turnout? I urge the journalists on this call to read carefully such bills as Senate Bill 329 with that question in mind. It's quite understandable that turnout data always attracts the most interest among the political parties, candidates, consultants, academics, and the news media. Voter registration numbers tend to attract less attention, but it's axiomatic that you can have the most sophisticated turnout efforts connected to intense, well-funded campaign, but if folks aren't registered to begin with, you're wasting at least some of your resources. A ready example is the amount of television advertising dollars wasted on the unregistered. Our report reveals that Indiana also has a big voter registration challenge, in addition to our demonstrably poor turnout experience. Our 2021 report shows that 69.3% of the Hoosiers surveyed reported they were registered, and this ranked us 39th. Well, now bear with me here. If you multiply that number, 69.3%, by Indiana's voting eligible population of 5 million on election day 2020, you can estimate that about 3,465,000 Hoosiers were registered and 1,535,000 were unregistered. Now, the 3,465,000 number doesn't come close to matching up with the Secretary of State's 2020 registration number of 4,751,370. But now bear with me. If you take that number, the 4,751,000 number, as a percentage of the voting eligible population of 5 million, you get 95%. No one seriously believes 95% of all Hoosiers, or of all eligible Hoosiers, were registered in advance of the 2020 elections. The point here is that any and all appropriate efforts to register eligible Hoosiers before the 2020 midterms are investment in increased turnout. And why do I believe that with such certainty? Well, if you take the number of Hoosiers who actually voted on election day, remember 3,068,625, as a percentage of the Hoosiers we estimate were actually registered, 3,465,000, you can therefore estimate that 88% of registered Hoosiers actually voted. So get people to register to vote, and they're going to take the next step and actually vote. So to summarize, how did we do in fulfilling recommendation number 2? Well, sadly, the numbers speak for themselves. We have a very, very long way to go before we as a state recapture our place among the top 10 states for voter registration and turnout. Okay, now I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Professor Ellen Zarletta. Professor Zarletta is the director of the IU Northwest Center for Regional Excellence and professor in the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at IU Northwest. She received her PhD from the University of Wisconsin and her JD summa cum laude from the University of Iowa. Ellen has been the principal author of the Indiana Civic Health Index since the 2015 edition. And I know I speak for Chuck and the entire team when I say that Ellen is just a brilliant and patient colleague and simply a wonderful human being. So Ellen, take it away.
Thank you so much, Bill and Chuck. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you this morning, and Chief Justice Shepard as well. I have, as Chuck and Bill have shared with you, we have made progress and there still remain some challenges. We might ask ourselves at this point in time, so how has Indiana actually changed over the decade that we had this opportunity to review? And so I'm going to share with you this morning some of the most important observations from that decade in review of data on Indiana civic engagement and We will then talk a little bit about how that sets the context for the course of action for the future, and take a little deeper dive into some of the other indicators other than voting and voter registration that are part of the Indiana Civic Health Index. So we examined, as Chuck said, 3 election cycles. That's 6 elections during the 10 years from 2010 to 2020. And by looking at the data over the course of this time, and I want to stress that the partners that have been on this project have incrementally examined the data and been thoughtful in their interpretation of the data and gathered input from all across the state on these and observations to help inform the recommendations. So by looking at the data, we can identify now, with the decade in review, some of the changes that took place, and then better determine a course of action for the future, including those recommendations that Chuck and Bill just shared. So a bit of background: in the Civic Health Index, we take a look at 3 categories of civic engagement. If we think of civic engagement as a decision to participate intentionally as a citizen in the democratic process, where we're actively engaging in public policy, connecting to our local officials, and direct service, then we can measure that participation by looking at 3 things: voter and voting registration behaviors, voting and voter registration behaviors, actions that demonstrate what we call civic awareness, and then lastly, the indicators of our social connectedness, such as group membership and volunteering. And I know that Chief Justice Shepard is going to be giving us a little bit more insight on that a little later. So I'm going to share some highlights from the comparison of the Indiana Civic Health Index in 2010 to 2020, building on Bill's analysis, some observations of some trends that we saw on voter turnout and voter registration, little different few pieces of information that you may not have heard prior. So let's take a look first at midterm versus presidential election year trends to see if there are any differences and what similarities there are. The data from the 2010 and 2020 period reveal that turnout and our registration rates are lower in midterm election years than those in presidential election years. In other words, fewer individuals are participating in midterm election year voting and registration than in presidential years. This may not seem surprising. However, what we did observe during that period was that these rates for registration and turnout during midterms actually improved from 2010 to 2020. Not only did the rates improve, but the state's rank also improved on both of the indicators, suggesting that Indiana was performing better than the other states during this decade of review. On the other hand, the presidential election turnout and voter registration over that decade tells a little different story. From 2012 to 2020 specifically, Indiana's rank, as was mentioned, fell on voting participation, and it rose only slightly on voter registration. So a different pattern that we're observing in the presidential election years than in the midterm years. So we see the data suggests these different trends. What can we conclude from the results? Well, one possibility is that we need to take a little deeper dive and understand better the reasons why Hoosiers increased their participation during the midterm election years as opposed to the presidential election years. We also saw a few other factors that seem to be connected to voting and voter registration behavior. Some of these are well documented in the literature. I'll share a little bit what's happening here in Indiana. The 3 factors that appear connected are income, education, and age. This is significant because we want to identify ways that we can better incentivize voting and voter registration as well as other activities that are connected to our civic health. So when it comes to income in the presidential election years, the percentage of Hoosiers voting increased as income levels increased. I'll just give you an idea of the differences. So voting rate in 2012 was 45.5%. For those in the lowest income category, that would be $35,000 or less, and 73.5% in the highest income category. So that's a difference there of about 28%. By the time we get to 2020, however, that gap has been reduced to about 18.4%. So their differences in the rates have diminished as time has passed with respect to income differences for voter participation. Education rate, the voting rates and registration rates increase substantially as educational attainment then increases. Those who have the highest voting and voter registration rates are those who have the bachelor's degrees or higher. And then the age groups that vote at the highest rates are those who are 45 years and older. These last results will suggest that some strategies aimed at inspiring our Hoosiers to participate civically can and should be targeted in such a way to achieve the most substantial gains to those groups that have some of the lowest rates. So while voting and voter registration is an important category, it's not the only category. Civic awareness and social connectedness are two others I'd just like to summarize some results for. When we look at civic awareness, we look at, for example, participation in social media, attendance at public meetings, and contact with our local officials. You can find these results on page 25 and 26. Interestingly, Indiana ranks 12th in the nation on one indicator of civic awareness, and that is Hoosiers posting their views on social, political, or local issues on the internet. So that is definitely one of our strengths if we look at civic awareness. We also have increased our participation in public meetings over that decade from 7.4 to 9.6%. And our contact with public officials has basically remained the same, an average of about 10.5% of Hoosiers connect at the local level with their local officials. So the data can and should give us some pause to reflect and continue to advocate for Indiana civic health, but there are reasons to celebrate. And one of these reasons would be our social and community connectedness. Very briefly, because I know that Chief Justice Shepard is going to give us some more information on this. Our volunteer rates over the period increased. Our rank moved from 32 to 18. We do well with talking with neighbors and doing favors for neighbors, so we're very locally connected. And lastly, Hoosiers donated more in 2020 than they did in 2010, and our rank increased from 45 to 33. So we see some of these indicators definitely showing promise for us and also informing us what it is that Hoosiers prefer to do when it comes to the forms of civic engagement that are so vital to us. It's now my pleasure and my honor to introduce Chief Justice Randall Shepard. Justice Shepard is a seventh generation Hoosier. He graduated from Princeton University, cum laude, and from Yale Law School. He's also received a Master of Laws degree in judicial process from the University of Virginia. Chief Justice Shepard was appointed to the Indiana Supreme Court by Governor Orr in 1985 at a very young age of 38. And he became Chief Justice of Indiana in March of 1987 and retired in 2012. At that point, he was the longest serving Chief Justice in Indiana history and the senior Chief Justice in the country state Supreme Courts. In addition to his service to the state of Indiana, he has an extensive history of service to the American Bar Association and the National Conference of Chief Justices, and was recently appointed by the U.S. Supreme Court Justice John Roberts to the U.S. Judicial Conference Advisory Committee on Civil Rules. Since retiring and leaving the court, he has continued to serve. He is a senior judge in the Indiana Court of Appeals, an executive in residence at IU's Public Policy Institute, and he teaches periodically at law schools in Indiana, and at NYU and at Yale. And in his free time, he helps us with the Indiana Civic Health Index, and his leadership is just invaluable. Chief Justice Shepard.
Thank you so much. You're very generous, and it's a pleasure to work with you and our other colleagues. As Dr. Zarletta said, I'm going to lift up a few things that have to do with how Indiana people live. What do they commit themselves to? How do they spend their time? As a general proposition, those numbers are more encouraging than our voting numbers. The things that Indiana people do are both big case and lower case. One of the things that's particularly interesting to me about this report is that the level of education that people in Indiana have achieved is described as equivalent to other states. That has not always been the case in recent decades, but 89% of our population have high school diplomas. That seems to me like a highly respectable number. And 27% have bachelor degrees. That's the field where we haven't done as well historically, though it has been the policy of several state administrations now over the last decade to find ways to encourage people to come back either for a bachelor's degree or some other kind of legitimate credential. We also do a very good job at volunteering. Ellen mentioned this. We're 18th best, and our percentage has gone up by something like almost a third above where it was in 2010. Our donations are now finally up over 51%. If you ask people, have you given to a charity, a school, a church, you now get 51%. And our posture there is sort of in middle ground, better than we have been historically. The another interesting piece I've always thought about the index is studying what you do at home. And one of the questions here has been, do you talk about issues with your family? And the answer is yes, and more so than 10 years ago. Now up to 35% talk about public issues with their families, and this places us 28th in the global or rather national scheme of things. So much of this, I'm sure you've heard people say this, people who move here from other states, and you ask them what their experience has been. One phrase that I hear every now and then is, "The people here are so nice. They talk to you and they ask you what you're doing, and they call you by name." And some of the other things that are on this list about volunteering or belonging to groups that Dr. Zarletta mentioned is something that people in Indiana now do. Our actual membership fell a little bit, but our national standing rose to 17th. Do you belong to things? So there are reasons for some confidence and pride in the future, and of course, as we've already heard, some areas where we could use some serious extra energy. It's been a privilege to be part of this. I thank the team for allowing me to participate.
Thank you, Justice Shepard. Appreciate it. And so now we're going to pause. I know we have some members of the media on the Zoom, and we encourage you that if you have questions that you'd like to submit to any of us on the panel, we'd be happy to field those. So probably the best thing, I think, is if you just want to unmute and announce yourselves that way. And if there's any particular person you want to address it to, or just the group in general, we'd be happy to do that. So we'll start with the online folks. We have a few here in person, but we want to make sure we get the online folks first. So let me pause there and see if there are any questions for the group.
Chuck, I have a question. It's Abdul Hakim Shabazz, WIBC Indy Politics. Bill, Ellen, Ms. Chief Justice, hope you all are doing well. Quick question on the engagement of the Civic Index. Is the goal to have more voter participation or better educated voter participation? Because we all know a bunch of people come together and make bad decisions, and doesn't make it a good decision just because a bunch of people got together and decided to make a bad decision. So I guess my question is it voter education and voter, or is it more participation, more education? Thanks.
Any of the members, Bill, I think you may have something that you want to add in on that, but since that was your focus, but.
Yeah, hey, Abdul, this has taken me back to our conversation in September of 2020, when we, as the Indiana Citizen, held a news conference to publish the findings of a Tufts University study that looked at voter registration among the youngest age cohorts and compared it with registration right before the 2016 presidential election vis-a-vis registration in August of 2020, and it proved or showed that looking inside the voter registration rolls of about 40 states, Indiana was actually had shown a decrease in the number of first-time voters who were signing up 2016 versus 2020. And in the course of that press conference, I'll never forget this, you said in your own inimitable way, it sounds like you guys are emphasizing quantity over quality. I bristled at that, and I'm bristling at that again today, because you've set up a false choice, and you actually set up a really rich conversation about how you think about democracy. Because the answer isn't either or, the answer is both. And, it begins with getting, especially our youngest, right, 18 and 19-year-olds, connected to the civic life of our state by getting them registered. And we know, been study after study after study that shows when Americans take that first step to get registered, they actually do then have an incentive to get informed before they cast that first ballot. So this isn't the Indiana Civic Health Index. First of all, is of course a report, right? It's data that has been adduced and then presented. The work of the Indiana Bar Foundation and the Civics Education Task Force, I think, is the prime example about how this group is committed to both elements of civic participation, registration and turnout, certainly, but creating more informed Hoosier voters along the way.
And let me just kind of add on to that for just a moment. From our perspective of civic education as our primary focus, we have found that in a lot of our efforts with civic education outreach and focused on the education part of it, that it leads to greater participation in voting and many other things. So they really are, I think, as Bill talked about, go hand in hand, that if you want to have more participation, there's an educational component and an outreach component, and you really need to do both. But we have found from our civic education perspective that the more, and especially the younger folks are, the more that they're engaged and have opportunities to engage, the more that reinforces those sort of civic habits for the rest of their lives. Dr. Zarletta or Justice Shepard, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, I just note that when we did finally decide that the Civic Index ought to make some recommendations, number one was to expand the level of education that young people get that creates a platform for them. And the success along those lines is moving well.
Thank you for the, Ellen, did you want to say something?
Well, just that I think that it's important to remember that we're, the report is an examination, right, of where we are. And then as we collect this data, we're thinking about where we need to go. And throughout, I know that the conversations have been, as we've gone out into the communities, conversations about both quantity and quality. And to Bill's point, I mean, it's very clear that when people do take the step to register, they have that incentive to become more informed and then ultimately to participate in the voting, in the democratic process. So I also see it as, an opportunity for us to think creatively about how we can bring together those two pieces to have the best civic health in the state of Indiana.
Thanks for that question. We have another question from anybody online. If not, I think we have a question maybe here in the room.
Yes, and this maybe plays off Abdul's question. If we go back to 2020, Indiana did redistricting. And there was a very large grassroots effort to educate the public about redistricting. They had meetings themselves with the public that were well attended. When the State House finally had its meetings around the state, they were incredibly well attended, even though they were during working hours. And these grassroots efforts also put up a draw your own districts, which was complicated software that people had to learn, but yet people participated. So my question to Bill and to the group, what are the lessons? Redistricting by itself is kind of a dry topic. It only comes every 10 years. And in 2020, 2021, we were worried about the pandemic, but yet Indiana really had this, seemed very vibrant, very robust discussion about redistricting. So if we look at voter participation, what are the lessons from redistricting that we can apply to increase getting more Hoosiers to the polling place?
Gosh. Well, I'm gonna resist the temptation to critique the special session that was called for the redistricting of the congressional, state house, and state senate districts, except to note that those who are in charge of the supermajority on the east end of Market Street now appear that they are just going to replicate the so-called process that was implemented by the folks in the supermajorities on the west end of Market Street. I know, I'm sorry, that may sound a little cynical, but it is predictive and it is accurate. But your question goes to the large number of Hoosiers who showed up for the field hearings about redistricting and whether we learn anything that can be applicable to turnout in 2020. Well, I think it's hopeful, right, that many people showed up. I think you can prove that the testimony was by and large ignored, and the hearings that were held, before the special session even started were not replicated during the special session or after the maps were released. Now, whether that's going to mobilize people to vote in the midterms, Marilyn, this much I have learned over my many years of involvement in the process. And that is campaigns, elections, issues tend to drive turnout. So we'll see whether the U.S. Senate race is contested, the Secretary of State's race, and whether there are contests down the ballot. Before I would make any predictions about turnout in 2022.
Well, first, congratulations to Bill for lifting up the fact that gerrymandering is a bipartisan sport. And it certainly has been over time. I've always thought that one of the things that has changed in the last few decades is the use of computers in gerrymandering makes it vastly more efficient and effective for whoever's pushing the button. I saw district drawing from the inside back at the very beginning of my career, and it was slow and laborious and unpredictable, and that's not what it is anymore. You know exactly what you're doing. It has seemed to me that one of the things that gerrymandering does over the long term, of course, is to take a set of offices and in effect, the voters, they're not sure why there's not much competition, but they know there's not much competition. I'm not sure how many, if you were to walk up to people as they came in the polls, how many people could tell you what gerrymandering was. It'd be a pretty good percentage, but a lot of people wouldn't recognize the word. But they might recognize it if they go in and find out that they're invited to vote for an office and there's only one contender. And under those circumstances, a few of them would say, why did I come today? So I think that has made a difference. It also clearly makes a difference in terms of primaries, because it changes the dynamic of whether your party wants to nominate somebody who's moving towards the center and can compete with the other guys. And that alters the kind of people who end up getting nominated and elected. The last thing I'd say is, we, with much cheerfulness, I don't know about how this goes in the rest of the country, but we decided to shrink the number of polling places in our state, one county at a time. And 2 or 3 years after that began, I did some calculations that suggested that that had made a difference, even if you did it right, even if you had very good polling places and you advertised them and the press put out the addresses and you could go into your computer and find out where you were supposed to go, that it simply was quite a difference, just because you couldn't go down to your neighborhood school or library or I can remember voting in people's garages where pretty much everybody knew each other. You didn't need voter ID. If somebody walked up and said, "Hi, my name is Randy Shepard," and it wasn't, they knew that they knew that. Anyway, I think some of that has made a difference in terms of turnout, and certainly the force of gerrymandering has done so in both directions.
So
I could
I
just
think
jump
our time
back in for a second. I pointed out this book that was published in 1979 by a bunch of PhDs. And on page 26, you'll love this. This is how they begin chapter 2. Indiana is a two-party state, all over, all the time, and in respect to every kind of activity.
Well, thank you all, and I think we'll leave it there. I think we're out of time for our meeting this morning. But if you have additional questions or follow-up, we'll be available. The report itself will be issued shortly after this concludes on our website and social media. So you can dig into that, and we encourage you to do that. And if you have additional follow-up questions, please let us know. And I want to, again, thank my colleagues, my friends, and supporters of this, especially those that are on the screen right now, Justice Shepard, Dr. Zarletta, and Bill Morrow. They've been instrumental to this whole process from the beginning. And again, we couldn't do it without them. So again, look for the full report on our website and social media, and we'll be happy to entertain any follow-up questions individually offline. If you want to reach out to us, please do, and we hope to talk more about this in the weeks and days to come. So thank you all. Appreciate it.